This is Chapter 4, Section 3, Succession. So we are talking about ecological succession, and what ecological succession is it is a series of predictable changes that occur within an ecosystem after some type of disturbance. This is something that can happen naturally in ecosystems. We can see organisms die off, and sometimes when we have these type of changes occur, it's actually a good thing, and it gives other organisms the chance to be able to survive in an ecosystem where they might not have the chance before when there was more competition. There are two types of ecological succession. They are primary and secondary succession, and we are going to talk about each one of those. Primary succession is when we have an ecological disturbance that has occurred, and it is left with an area of rock that is exposed. This means that there is no topsoil in place, or there's nothing left of a previous type of ecosystem in the area. And you can see in the image below that when you're looking at this type of succession, we start with a rock base, and it takes many years for an organism to take and repopulate that because they don't have a topsoil base to start from. This usually occurs slowly at first since they do not have that base to build off of, but changes will continue for centuries afterwards. The first to colonize in primary succession are referred to as pioneer species. Think about the pioneers that went out west. They were the first ones to set off and explore the west. We called them pioneers. So a pioneer species is going to be the first thing to come back and colonize an area after we have some type of disturbance. Maybe these disturbances could have been something like a volcano erupting and the lava coming down, and eventually the lava cools and you're left with rock. First things to come back would be things like your moss and your lichens. These types of pioneer species do not require any soil for growth. A lichen is a combination of like a fungus and an algae, and they're able to grow right on the rocks. And what happens is the roots that are there, they start to secrete an acid, and it breaks down those rocks. And when it breaks down those rocks, what happens is that it starts to form a soil in order for other organisms to be able to start to inhabit that area. Secondary succession is when we actually have the soil that has remained intact. So we still have some type of soil there in order for the organism to be able to start to recolonate. They don't have to wait for some soil to be replaced. So examples of this might be things like a hurricane, a landslide, a mudslide. Times where we actually have the soil and the soil remains intact, but the ecosystem was disturbed, so it does need time to take and regenerate and recolonize that with more plants and other organisms. Secondary succession will proceed faster than primary succession because with secondary succession, we don't have to wait for the soil to get made. So since the soil does not need to be broken down and it does not need to start all over, again, it's going to occur faster than what we had with primary succession. This is something that happens naturally. Remember, every ecosystem will change over time. Sometimes the disturbances that we have in our ecosystems do allow for other organisms to be able to come in and colonize that area. You might see new plants, you might see new species come in because they weren't able to compete before, but now that there's been this drastic change in the ecosystem, they might be able to come in and repopularize that area. Over time, our ecosystem will return back to a mature community. Remember that our ecosystems are always in a constant state of flux where there are always changes happening, and it never stays exactly the same. And that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about something like a climax community. Really, a climax community is probably something that is mostly hypothetical. A climax community is a stable community that results when there is really little change. This is where it is like in a constant state. It's reached the climax. But in all honesty, it's really something that is more of a hypothetical than a reality, because your ecosystems are affected by many different things and they're in a constant state of change. So let's talk about Section 4. Section 4 is a little bit lengthy. It's about biomes. You should remember discussing biomes probably in 7th grade. So let's do a quick refresher about what a biome is. There are 10 different biomes located in our biosphere. They are very distinct climate communities with very distinct organisms. Remember that a biome is defined both by abiotic features and also by biotic features. So the living and the non-living things help us define what is a particular biome. Biomes are affected by their climate, their soil type, and the plants and animals that can live there. That is how we define them. Each biome has a certain type of seasonal pattern. The weather, the temperature, the precipitation is what helps determine what biome that you do have. The diagram that you see there will show you an example of the weather that we see in a particular area over a year's time. These averages determine what type of biome we have, along with the types of plants and animals that can exist there. So let's talk about the land biomes. The first one we're going to talk about is the tropical rainforest. The tropical rainforest is hot and humid and wet year-round. They get at least 2 meters of rain, so it rains every day. It doesn't necessarily rain all day, but it does rain every day. They have very thin, nutrient-poor soil that is subject to erosion, which means it washes away very easy. The problem with this is that a lot of our rainforests get cut down, and the soil is so poor because of everything that's there, and that there's not a lot of decay of the plants returning nutrients and that to the soil, that it is really hard for us to regenerate a tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforests are extremely important for the amount of oxygen that they put into the ecosystem, and they also have more species than all of the other biomes combined. They have very tall trees that create a covering, which we refer to as the canopy. The levels that are underneath that are called the understory. The understory is darker because of the canopy and how much light it actually blocks out because of how thick it is. So many of the plants have to compete, and they have to be very well adapted in order to compete for sunlight and the other resources in that ecosystem. When we talk about animals, animals are active year-round. They are typically very well camouflaged so that they can hide from predators. And they have some very cool adaptations for things like jumping, climbing, and or flight. Next, we're going to move on to the tropical seasonal forest or the tropical dry forest. So they have seasons. They have a rainy season and they have a dry season. They are warm year-round because they are in that tropical band. The soil is a little bit better than like what we see in the tropical rainforest because they do have seasons. So you have plants losing leaves, returning nutrients and that to the soil. But again, because of those rains that we do get during the rainy season, they are subject to erosion. Your plants are adapted to survive during that dry season, so it would be like what we see here in Pennsylvania, where we have our plants losing their leaves. Those are referred to as deciduous trees to make it through the dry season. We'll have many animals who either go into a state of something like hibernation during these dry seasons in order to survive, or we would have them migrating in order to try to find water. The tropical savanna. This is where we find, like throughout Africa, warm seasonal rain, very hot summers with a rainy, warm or cool, dry winters. When we say cool, that means they're still rather warm. They're just cooler than what the summers are. Most seasonal rainfall comes in the summer months. There are more rain than what we find in the desert, but less rain than what we find in those tropical dry forests. The tropical savanna also will have some trees. They have more low-lying plants. The soil is compact, but because of that dry season, they are prone to frequent fires. The plants are adapted in order to try to survive some of those fires, and in order to try to retain that heat, they'll have a waxy covering on their leaves to hold the water in and help to protect them. Again, during our dry seasons, what we're going to see is that many animals would migrate in order to find water. You might also have some organisms that would burrow down in and remain in a dormant state during this time in order to survive dry times. Desert is going to receive the least amount of precipitation. They receive less than 25 centimeters of precipitation yearly. The temperature extremes can alternate from very, very hot in the day to being extremely cold at night, because there's nothing there on the grounds in order to hold those temperatures in. So the nights tend to be much colder than what we have in the daytime. Deserts are found on every continent except Europe. Remember that not all deserts have sand. It is not based on whether they have sand or not. It is based on the amount of precipitation, their temperatures, where they are located, and the plants and animals that are found in them. The deserts have a different type of soil than what we find in other places. They are rich in minerals, but they are very poor in organic materials because we don't have plants losing their leaves and decomposing and returning those nutrients and that to the soil. The plants have to be very specifically designed and adapted to survive those very dry climates. This is why we don't see plants with big, broad leaves, because big, broad leaves lose a lot more water. The spines that we see on a cactus are going to be adapted. They're adapted leaves because they do not lose water like our big, broad-leaved plants will. They also do a modified photosynthesis where they only open their pores at night so that they don't lose so much water. Again, your desert animals are also adapted. Many of them are more active at night than during the day because the heat during the day can be too much for them. Other adaptations are they'll get most of their water through the food that they eat. Temperate grassland. This is what would be found more in like the U.S. and our Midwest states. Temperate grasslands experience warm to hot summers, cold winters, with a seasonal precipitation. The soil is fertile, but because it is the grasslands, they are also prone to fires. Because they are so open, they don't have a lot of big, tall trees. It's often very flat. Animals have to be very adapted in order to survive. They're good at camouflage, burrowing, things like that, so that they can avoid their predators. A lot of our grassland plants are very well adapted to this area. They have a resistance to the fires that can go